Okay, so this is part two. Hope everyone is staying warm during the snowpocalypse, um, and or the cold apocalypse. I can't even say that. Anyway, um, yeah. At least it's kind of pretty if you're able to be inside. You can actually kind of enjoy it. It's a little scary, but anyway. Um, so we're going to talk about sustainability next. Sustainability has to do with um, basically thinking about how your project is going to grow over time. So part of this is thinking about adapting to changes in technology. So this is why it's good to follow web standards and kind of um, be cautious about um, sometimes even like uh, coding add-ons and new um, tips that you can kind of. I mean, there's lots of tools out there, right? If you do a search for there's even something like Bootstrap, which is kind of an alternative to what we'll be using as grids. I'll let you Google that on your own, but um, so part of that might not be as relevant if you're not interested in kind of pursuing coding further, but just thinking about you know using kind of thinking about how technology changes and whether that technology is going to, or the technology that you use, whether it's going to last. Um, and also keeping in mind that, you know, standards will eventually kind of change over time. So you do have to kind of brush up on, what are the most recent standards and what will make your website accessible across different devices. Um, so being aware of that, but also thinking about uh, will I be able to hand this website over to a different set of designers and developers? This is yet another reason to follow, web standards and to kind of um, not be sloppy with your code when you develop your website, because if you need to hand it off to different developers or even sometimes writers, you you don't want them to have to try to figure out, you know, your own unique way of organizing things. It should be um, thinking about, designing it in a way that anyone can kind of pick it up and understand, oh, right, I can see how this is organized. Um, so the other thing, so I wanted to show you an example of, in terms of your professional portfolios, how you can design it in a way that makes room for future projects that you might have. So this is from a student from last semester, Kaylee. Kaylee did a really awesome job here. So we're going to revisit this when we talk about design principles. So, but the main thing I wanted to show you in terms of sustainability is that she's created. You can even click on, these different areas that she has: UX, UI, and then photography. Notice that she only has one item for photography here, and only two here, whereas graphic design she has quite a few. And yet she's got a system in place so you could tell like this is what it's going to look like when you have more pieces. Excuse me, more pieces. Um, and she's got a system down now for making space for the other things that she does, and she could easily add another category. Um, so thinking about the system that you're going to create and take into account like, oh, I may not have a lot of projects in this area right now, but they will grow. Okay. Um, and then um, this last part is basically just saying that there are certain. I've just talked about kind of how the technology can change and you have to account for that, but there are certain things that won't change. So knowing the basics will help you make sure that your website is sustainable. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the CRAP principles. So uh, CRAP is like your standard acronym that designers use all the time. So contrast, repetition, alignment, proximity. So contrast is about color, size, type, heading, shape. Um, we've talked about this in terms of accessibility, why it's very important um, to have enough contrast between like the background color and the font color. Um, repetition. This is especially important with navigation, consistency. This is huge in terms of findability, um, because it kind of helps if you repeat patterns. It helps you identify, okay, this is a group and this is a group. Um, I'm about to show you some examples too. Alignment is basically where you're. Um, it's similar to repetition, but it's kind of, how are you aligning your navigation, but also the content itself. And this has to do with grids too. So we've talked about fluid grids, or basically, let me go to the Zen Gardens. Oops, I need more information. Just notice how it adjusts to um, this column gets kind of stacked when you move it, right? It gets moved down here. So when you think about alignment and things like that, part of that is thinking about or making sure that you're using the grid system, which will automatically kind of reorganize how things are aligned in a way that makes sense, so that when a person resizes the browser, which we often do, or when they're looking at it on a phone, um, it'll still look aesthetically pleasing, but also it's still accessible. So remember that from our discussion on Monday about accessibility, that of utmost importance is making a website accessible to people who have um, disabilities or um, circumstances, right? Um, you want them to be able to have access to the information, but um, part of making it accessible is having a design that is um, easily navigable. So that has to do with what we're talking about now, which is easily findable. Just, are you using these principles that help us make sense of what we're looking at cognitively? It should be, it's going back to what I said earlier, which is, don't make me think. It should be very intuitive how to navigate through your site. So that's why thinking about fluid grids with navigation is important too. Okay. Okay, and then proximity has to do with grouping how you group things together, but also spacing and white space. So if you remember, I'm gonna go quick to the Apple site. Look how much kind of white space there is. There's not, relatively speaking, when you first land on this page, there's not much, especially like this right here. A lot of white space around here, so that you just focus on like a few things, right? And then it gets a little bit more complicated once you're, especially for browsing for things. But even so, there's just a few blocks with just like an image and then just a little bit of text. So being conscious of what are the kind of trends in terms of how people use white space, and starting to um, think about these CRAP principles. Um, it's kind of like uh, you learn to read websites as a designer. So really start to pay attention to that. The other thing that I want you to pay attention to is the rule of thirds and kind of this Z pattern that we have, that we use when we read something. So I'll give you an example. Let's go back to this. well, even if we look at just this picture right here, keep in mind that we usually, the Z pattern is that we start here at the top left corner, typically. Of course, that might vary also by culture. If you read this way, it might be a little bit different, right? Um, but typically, um, you're gonna start here, and then you're gonna kind of your eye will move here, and then go down here, down here. So knowing that, you know, starting with what do you want them to see first, and then notice that it ends with reading our story, so that all of this gets in our perception before we read the story. So this is very well laid out in terms of where you put the text. And so I want you to pause this and watch this video. So remember, this is class number 7 um, under the schedule. You should be able to click on this presentation and watch this video. It's a very short video, but it's basically talking about this other grid system, which is the rule of thirds. So, and basically the point of it is that you can take any photo image and you can divide it um, into thirds, both uh, horizontally and vertically. Um, so if this was an image, this is the top third, um, horizontally, second, third, second, third, third, and this way. And it's basically saying that you want your main points of interest to be at the intersections of this grid. But there's a lot more to it than that. So yeah, watch this video. It's very useful. And there's so much out there. I mean, take a look around, um, even on YouTube for um, photography tips. Like there's, um, but there's also, I think, just once you watch this video, you you should develop the practice of looking at websites with that designer eye and kind of thinking about how might I want to use the same technique that they're using. Um, so okay, so you should have watched that video. Let's look at some examples.